Hi everyone, this is Cheryl DeMars and I am the President and CEO of the Alliance. I want to thank you all for joining our webinar today, Pave Your Own Path, Taking Control of Your Prescription Drug Costs. For starters, I want to thank you all for joining us for this presentation during what are very unusual circumstances. Our thoughts are certainly with the healthcare providers, the essential employees, and everyone else on the front lines of this pandemic. We are also thinking of our members who, and we hope you're all well. We know you're doing everything you can to keep your workforces intact, safe, engaged, and healthy during these particularly difficult times. Thank you to all of you who are making a big difference in your communities. I'm happy to report that the Alliance is continuing our operations remotely. All of our staff are working from home, probably in their pajamas. And as always, we are repricing claims, adding new providers to the network, addressing the needs of our members, and responding to calls and inquiries. And while we continue with the services you've come to rely on, we're also looking for new ways to help. In addition to this webinar, we're planning on hosting some employer roundtables in the near future to help our members stay connected and informed. We'll be looking for input because our members will be choosing the topics for those discussions. So be sure to keep your eye on your email in the coming weeks for more details. Before I introduce today's program, I want to let you know that you are all in mute mode. So if you have questions during the webinar, please send them via the chat box. And by the way, we have 194 people registered for this webinar, which is amazing. Jennifer Austin, our Director of Marketing, will be gathering all the questions and relaying them to Josh at the end of his presentation to help facilitate the conversation. And we'll do our best to get all of your questions answered at the end of the webinar. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Josh Bindl. Josh is the CEO of National CooperativeRx, a national not-for-profit pharmacy benefits purchasing cooperative representing employer groups, unions, and coalitions who sponsor a health plan. The Alliance was one of the founding members of NCRX, which was launched in 2004. We formed NCRX because then, as now, we recognize that employers need dedicated expertise to help them navigate the complex and costly arena of prescription drug purchasing. Today, NCRX looks after the health and well-being of over 375,000 participants by keeping costs low and adding value for members through joint purchasing and strategic clinical oversight programs. Before coming to National CooperativeRx, Josh served as the Director of Programs and Services for the Wisconsin Counties Association. There he led the WCA Group Health Trust, a self-funded employee health benefits trust which grew from 8,000 to 50,000 participants during his tenure. And now please welcome our friend and colleague, Josh Bindl. Josh?
Thank you, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining during these unusual times. And thanks to the Alliance for having me here to talk about prescription drugs. Certainly love to present to you in person at the Alliance annual seminar, but instead I'm in my basement, hoping that the dog doesn't bark too much and the kids don't run down the stairs like a herd of elephants, which has been a challenge. Based on the attendance, it seems like people will literally listen to anything, including talk about PBM contracting, to get away from some of our COVID-19 talk. So hopefully you're getting enough of that elsewhere because I'm not going to dive into that topic at all. I will dive into PBM contracting. We'll talk controlling Rx spend. We got a few comments about developing trends in the industry, and then I'll hit a little bit on the pipeline, although I'm not a pharmacist, so you are not going to get a lot of details about the pipeline, more just classes that are up and coming. So Cheryl gave a great intro of National CooperativeRx. I will just add that we are organized just like the Alliance, not-for-profit cooperative, owned and governed by our members. Really the only difference between the Alliance and us is that we are solely focused on prescription drugs. We have no other functions of the cooperative except for that. It certainly keeps our 21 staff busy. Cheryl mentioned how we're structured, so 260 member organizations all coming together, 375,000 participant lives in 22 different states, purchasing together one pharmacy benefits contract. So employers, in our opinion, have a fundamental problem when it comes to prescription benefits, and that is they spend too much. We also think that a lot of times patients spend too much. So to start talking about where we look when controlling costs, we think the fundamental area is PBM contracting. So pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, have taken a lot of heat in the media over the last few years. It's gotten so bad that we now will open some presentations, like I am today, talking about the value, reminding people of the value of PBMs, because pharma and pharmacies have done a very good job discrediting PBMs. We all think of them as villains now, unnecessary people in the middle that are just taking profit. In reality, pharma and pharmacies are discrediting them because then they have more power and they can increase prices. PBMs were created and their role now is to negotiate lower prices. That's lower prices for payers, so employer groups. They also look to encourage cost-effective utilization, so making sure that the patient is taking the appropriate medication. A lot of times through formulary, they'll do that. I'll talk about formulary in a little bit. They're there to provide education, and that's a significant role that we play at the cooperative now as well, because patients and even doctors sometimes will get their education on prescription drugs from direct-to-consumer advertising and pharmaceutical marketing programs in general, which we all know that those are not provided impartially. PBMs are also watching over the prescriptions to make sure that the drugs that an individual is on are safe to interact with one another and that they're actually going to help the patient. And then finally, adherence, so making sure that the person with high cholesterol is taking their medication to prevent that heart attack or stroke from happening. But we all know that PBMs need to be watched, so that's a lot of the points I'll give you today, at least at the beginning. PBMs have become very large, especially the big three. So the three largest are, I call them very large bureaucratic companies that are making up over 75% of the total market. They're for-profit, which there's nothing wrong with that, but understand that they have pressure to maximize their shareholder returns. The market is a very complex pricing scheme, so a lot of people refer to it as a shell game. It's hard to understand, which puts the PBM at a great advantage. If you let them, they have the ability to reclassify a lot of prescription medications if definitions are weak, which even after you've signed that contract, they can change the financials of that contract by simply reclassifying a drug if the contract allows. And then they are often slow to react to industry abuse. So take the compound issue from several years ago. The PBMs, many put programs in place months, if not a year plus later, then we realized that compounding pharmacies were coming to market with very expensive mixtures of medications that really didn't need to be on the market. It was just an abuse. PBMs allowed it to happen because they're slow to react. They also were making money off of it, so it really wasn't in their best interest to react. So to understand the world that the prescription drugs live in, you kind of need to understand this drug supply chain. So it looks pretty easy, right? Certainly not. Or just understand what the ultimate claim cost is. So it's pretty easy. It's just that average wholesale price minus the discount plus the dispensing fee plus sales tax. That gets you to the claim cost minus the copay plus the PBM's fee. That's the net claim cost, but then you minus the rebate. That gets you to the ultimate claim cost. So that's not very clear either. So when you get to the contract, some of the things that you need to be aware of, generally what you can get out of a PBM will not only depend on the size of the purchasing group or employer that is doing the contract, but it's also going to depend on the PBM. So the big three PBM will get great discounts and rebates and all of that, but if your size is small, they may not be as willing to give you strong pricing as maybe a middle market PBM that you mean more to. So a lot of different things go into what you can get from the terms or from some of the things that I'm going to give you here. But these are things that you should be aware of so that you can maximize or at least understand the things that you need to ask for. So I mentioned defining terms. So make sure that you have a strong definition of what a brand medication is, what a generic medication is, what a specialty medication is. If that language is loose, then the PBM can move drugs around between classifications. The rebate definition is very significant right now. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We always say trust but verify. So make sure that you're auditing your contract guarantees. Don't leave it up to the PBM to self-report. Make sure that an audit is done to see if they actually achieved what they said they were going to achieve in the contract. And then certainly don't let them pick that auditor. Some contracts that we've seen allow the PBM to say it will be audited and the PBM will pick the auditor. Not a best practice, certainly. So when it comes to rebates, rebates have become a huge pricing component of prescription drugs right now. And good or bad, they're there. And if you're not getting a significant portion of total gross costs back in the form of rebates, then somebody's keeping it somewhere in the supply chain. A lot of groups will tell us, well, we're getting 100% pass-through rebates. Yet when we show them that our contract will double their rebates, they're like, well, how is that possible? We're getting 100% pass-through. Well, PBMs have a very narrow definition of rebates, if you let them, what a rebatable drug is. And across all of National CooperativeRx for 2019, we saw 24.8% of gross costs coming back to our members in the form of rebates. And we get that 100% rebate pass-through, but a very broad definition. I guess the other thing to point out here is our members are not chasing rebates. So a lot of people will say, well, don't chase rebates. We're not. We have a list of medications that we actually recommend to our membership that they don't cover because they are very high cost, low, if any value medication that really wouldn't be on the market if not for some of the pricing games that go on. And we recommend to our members they don't cover those, and thus they have rebate impact. That's the reason that the price is so high. So our members are not actually getting rebates on those medications. When you do that contract, make sure you understand how the rebate guarantee works. So it could be on a per brand. We do per claim to eliminate the incentive for that brand generic classification game that I talked about. Some contracts, and this is very common, we will see a per rebatable brand, and that's just going to further narrow the rebate value. And then if you do get 100% pass-through rebates, make sure that you have an opportunity at the end to true up. Make sure that there's 100% pass-through that can be audited, although it's very expensive. So you have to be a pretty large size or be part of a large group if you're going to audit the rebate 100% pass-through. Specialty is still a very significant area of spend, so we're almost 50% of total spend in the specialty category now. Make sure that it is defined in your contract. It's very common for us to see a contract that does not define specialty, or it is a very broad definition which allows all sorts of games to go on. See if you're getting an overall discount on those drugs, or if you're getting a specialty fee schedule that shows the discount for each specialty medication. And then see if you're getting an overall guaranteed discount off of those specialty medications. How are the new to market specialty being priced? It's pretty common to see an AWP discount of 15% on those. And then new to market limited distribution drugs are another category. See if they're called out in the contract. Oftentimes they're excluded from discounts, guarantees, rebate calculations. And then how are specialty generics priced? So you want to make sure that they're not, you're not getting the overall specialty discount for those. Certainly there is a lot deeper discount that can be had on some of those specialty generics. I also want to mention pass-through before I get to the next slide. So I mean, there's pass-through pricing, there's traditional pricing. I will call it another nuance is, fully transparent, sometimes pass-through versus fully transparent. I think there can even be some differences there. I think, they're just different. You need to understand how they're different. There are a lot of pass-through contracts that we see that are not necessarily transparent. There can be games that go on there. We find the most value in traditional pricing, and that's why our contract is that way, because we see that the PBM is willing to bet on the future value of their contract, and it doesn't really bother us that the PBM is incentive to make more money when our groups, our employers that are on our plan, end up saving money. So kind of aligns incentives there. Yes, there are certain games that can go on in a traditional pricing model, but if you have the knowledge to watch over those, then you can ward off a lot of those games that can be played. So when you're looking at analyzing, different PBM offerings, you have to make sure that they're apples to apples. So make sure that if there are any plan design requirements of any of the offers, that is called out. There may be a certain formulary that could be required for the proposal that's on the table. It's very common. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just you have to understand that, there could be differences based on whatever formulary the PBM put in the offer. There are also maybe certain clinical programs that are turned on. Could maybe be a narrow network. A narrow network could increase the discounts quite a bit. So if your plan, your members are not going to be able to use that narrow network, it's going to make a lot of people unhappy, then certainly you don't want that to be as part of one of the offers, because it's not realistic to put in place. And then make sure that you have access to data. So a lot of contracts are silent on data, who's right to the data. Certainly self-funded plan sponsors, you need access to the data to analyze the cost drivers. May need it for any of your wellness programs, disease management, and then certainly if you're going to audit the PBM, you're going to need access to data. So the PBM certainly want to control that data. A lot of times we will hear, well, we can get data, but it takes a month. That shouldn't happen. Make sure that you have access to your data and it can be gotten in a timely manner. And then the final slide on contracting. So PBMs are there to take risks away from the employer, and it's their contract that they need to stand behind that performance. It's the same thing we believe for their staff and their customer satisfaction guarantees. Put penalties in there, because if you don't have a penalty in there and you get upset with your PBM, you really have nothing to hold their feet to the fire with. It's them saying they're sorry and hoping that you don't want to move once your contract comes up. Termination provisions are tricky. Longer term commitments will generally garner a greater contract, meaning contract financial, so discounts and guarantees. But make sure that you have market check capabilities, because this market is changing very rapidly. We'll talk biosimilars at the end, but even the specialty class in general right now, constant new to drugs coming to market. If your contract is not keeping up on it, that means the PBM can really put in place whatever they want, not update the contract. That's why that market check is so important. You could do a one-year contract, but then you're not going to get the same discounts and rebate guarantees because the PBM doesn't have as much time to make good on their commitments. So I guess my only final point is on all this PBM contract talk, would maybe be some advice. So thinking if you're home looking to balance kind of the work from home dynamic now and take care of your kids, but there's always that opportunity. You could read a PBM contract at the same time as you're trying to maybe put them to sleep. A couple points of understanding that you might pick up, and at the end of it, you get a little bit of quiet time, which I think we could all use right now. All right, so I'll move on to some best practices in controlling spend. These are our opinions based on the over 900 plans that we work with across the cooperative. Certainly there's lots of different recommendations. I'm just going to go through some of the basic ones, give you a flavor of what we recommend to our groups. So first off, at least 4-tier plan design. I mean, a lot of times you're going to hear 3-tier differentials. We're we're looking more at 4. I know there's as many as 6-tier differentials now as you look into specialty and maybe breaking out preferred, non-preferred, generics, and specialty. Coinsurance, we recommend. We know that this is not for everyone, as a lot of people don't like coinsurance, but certainly promotes consumerism and drives good patient behavior, drives awareness over the price of some of these medications. We recommend you either encourage or even mandate generics. We'll talk about the value of generics in a little bit. Same with mail order. If mail order is feasible for your plan, we certainly think that encourage or mandate it. There are pretty deep discounts on mail order, and there's the adherence dynamic that the maintenance medication is on refill, automatic refill, and patients are then taking it more regularly. And then we're big proponents of formulary, and some will say that formularies are only there to disrupt members and maximize PBM profits. But if you have a strong contract, that formulary is really there to drive value for the plan sponsor and for employees and their family members. So formularies will remove waste, so the high-cost, low-value medications that I've been discussing, we'll remove some of those, put them on a different tier, higher-cost tier. We'll also promote generics when appropriate. The other thing that a formulary will do is when there are no meaningful clinical differences between medications in a drug class, the PBM will leverage the competitive forces in that class to generate lower prices from pharma. This gets to our rebate dynamic. So that's why there are so many rebates. As we get more competition, the PBM can pit them against one another and drive that rebate value. There can also be very large price differences between drugs that do the exact same thing, and a formulary can get rid of the ones that are extremely off the charts in terms of price, as I mentioned. Generics is a best practice, so kind of shocking numbers. For every 1% that you improve the generic dispensing rate on your plan, overall plan savings can be 1 to 2.5% lower, or plan costs can be 1 to 2.5% lower as a result of that. You look at the groups in National CooperativeRx that have turned on, in our opinion, all the right levers. The best-in-class generic dispensing rate in 2019 was 90.4% across that group of members. I know there's a lot going on this slide, but the main thing I want to point out here is, where formularies, some will still say they're controversial, but when they first came on, there was a lot of, distaste for them. They really become mainstream, especially in our opinion. So 95% of groups in National CooperativeRx have a formulary turned on, and 56% of them are on one of our advanced formularies. Now the PBM, as we talk about, the PBM needs to be watched over. Yes, in formularies, PBMs do play games, and they will allow certain medications that, in our opinion, we don't think that they should allow. So we've recommended a list of drugs to our member owner groups that you can lock these drugs out. I call them low-hanging fruit. We got an example of one on slide 23. So Trexamet is a combination of 2 ingredients that can be gotten generically, but Trexamet itself for 9 doses costs $1,000. We recommend locking out Trexamet because those 2 generic ingredients would cost $7. So if you think about that, if an individual filled Trexamet, they're likely going to pay more in member cost share in a copay than $7. So in this situation, Trexamet, it's no different than those 2 generics, just, the 2 generics have to be taken 2 different pills at the same time. That equals the Trexamet. There's savings to the individual patient, and there's significant savings to the plan. There's also something called authorized generics. So some patients will say, well, I can't take the generic. Well, with an authorized generic, that drug is exactly the same as the brand name medication. It's the same color, shape, and imprint as that brand name medication. It's just sold at a lower price. So on slide 24 is an example of that. Atorvastatin, produced by Greenstone, or I should say labeled by Greenstone. The brand equivalent is Lipitor. So Pfizer actually owns Greenstone, and Pfizer's the company that produces Lipitor. So it's possible if these are coming off the exact same assembly line, it's just atorvastatin, that one gets labeled atorvastatin, same drug comes off, that drug gets labeled Lipitor, and they get priced at 2 different price points. So there are a whole host of these. We recommend our groups lock out, like in this example, Lipitor, and only cover atorvastatin. Specialty is a very significant area of cost. So remember that specialty medications are about 1 to 2% of the population that are taking these medications, but they're 50% of total plan costs now. So our basic recommendation is analyze the PBM's programs, but likely turn them on, because generally these patients are accustomed to navigating a system when they're on complex medications and expensive medications. They know that there are some hoops that they're going to have to jump through in order to get these medications. So evidence-based guidelines are one area of program from the PBM. So generally make sure that the person is going to get value out of taking the complex medication before they take it. You can also limit the network to only the PBM specialty pharmacy, which is going to drive better outcomes, but then also lower costs. So the PBM is dealing in these rare, oftentimes complex medications far more frequently than a local pharmacist is. Local pharmacist also is going to have to order these medications. So, going through the PBM's specialty pharmacy is not going to be a lot different, and the pharmacy is going to be more educated, the PBM pharmacy is. You could allow where the first fill you could get at a local pharmacy if somebody feels more comfortable with that, but then once they're on the therapy, they would have to switch over to the narrow network. Don't love that idea for some medications because of the instructions that may need to go with administering that medication, but it's out there, and we certainly have a number of groups that do it. I talked about specialty cost share tiers, so these can be broken out now, where before you may have just had specialty in the highest cost share tier. You can actually break out specialty alone, even 3 different tiers. Then you also could limit, let's say, the first fill of a medication. So 30-day supply, let's say only allow 15-day supply on the first fill, because if the patient is not going to respond to the medication or is going to have side effects and quit the medication over the first 15 days, you don't want 15 more days of that medication, which could be $10,000 plus, just sitting there not being used. So find out if it's going to benefit them before they actually get a full 30-day supply. A newer program has to do with copay coupon card programs. So pharma has these copay coupon card programs to essentially pay down a patient's out-of-pocket costs, which also results in it undermining plan design. So the patient uses a coupon, copay may go down to 0 or it's nominal, pharma pays for that coupon. Well, in reality, plan sponsors are paying for it because pharma's just jacked up the price of that medication to pay for their program. PBMs came out with a program to basically get at that issue when they have insight into it. So make sure that if a coupon is used, the patient is not getting credit towards their out-of-pocket maximums, so-called True Accumulation program. Across our membership that have been able to put it in place, there was $3.3 million in savings as a result of this in 2019, and total coupon value across, again, 375,000 lives, total coupon value of $5.4 million in 2019. That is up significantly just in the last couple of years. I think 2 years ago, we saw total coupon value across our group at it was under 2 million. I know that. So a program that you can turn on, yes, individuals don't like it. I tend to think that those individuals have benefited from this for many years, where some patients aren't able to benefit from this because they're not on one of these drugs that have coupon value. They are actually paying their true out-of-pocket costs for the plan. I'll leave you with a few benchmark data points. So these, the first column is Alliance members that are also National CooperativeRx members. And then I show you all National CooperativeRx members. So certainly we have groups that are higher or lower than these numbers, but these are our averages. So patient cost share, you can see generally in that 10, 11% range. Generic dispensing rate across all groups, 88% roughly. A good benchmark to go back and check your plan and see what you're at, and maybe some of the levers that I've talked about are not turned on. That's why your generics are not up there as high. Specialty, you can see approaching 50%. And then I talked about, well, actually I haven't talked about the rebate value yet. I'll show you a slide in a little bit, but gross cost net of rebates, Alliance members doing very well at $760 per member per year. Again, that's all groups that are Alliance and NCRX. And then all of our NCRX members, $871. So some developing trends going on in this industry. First off, I mean, until March, there was a lot of focus on rising prescription drug costs. That attention has turned into pharma actually tempering a little bit their price increases. So if you go back to 2014, their mean price increase for January, and a lot of times pharma will increase prices in January and then do it again in July. This is just January. But 2014, they're at 12% mean increase. It's down to 5% in 2020. National CooperativeRx has actually been on a pretty amazing run the last 3 years. And as much as, I like to put this in here to toot our own horn, I put it in here to say, if you manage your costs, if you put, the right levers in place, you can overcome some of these cost increase issues. Now, if you get hit with the specialty medication that is not preventable, there's not a lot you can do. You may see a spike, but we always advocate, manage what you can manage. So across the cooperative, a lot of management going on. Groups have been able to actually lower their price, lower their costs throughout the last 3 years. And if you look at our comparison, 2019 costs net of rebates were lower than 2016, even though there's all this attention to rising costs. And this is that rebate slide I wanted to share. So it's rebates as a percent of gross costs across the cooperative. So you can see from 2016 at 15%, it's jumped all the way to almost 25% in 2019. I give you this information because if your plan is not getting numbers that are close to this, somebody is keeping that money. If you're not getting rebate value, I would understand why you don't like prescription drug rebates. But for our groups that are getting their true value, it is holding down the cost of prescription drugs. Moving on to a couple of public policy points. So at the federal level, hundreds of proposals that are out there, limited impact. So there is a prohibition on gag clause that was passed. So essentially gag clause said that a pharmacist could not tell a patient that there was a lower cost medication. That is now prohibited in pharmacy and PBM contracts. There's also a new anti-kickback rule. So this was generally in health plans where they would say if the real cost of the drug was $3, but there was a $10 copay, the patient would still be charged $10. So it was rare in the most recent years, but it was still out there a little bit. The feds did pass laws outlawing it. So you may say, there's all this attention on prescription drug prices, and but prices have actually come down. Why are people still upset? And honestly, some of the reasons that people are upset is patients are more aware of costs. So you've got these high deductible health plans, you've got higher out of pockets, you've got formularies. I mean, patients are more aware than they used to be. So elected officials are hearing from patients that costs are high. That's one of the reasons that PBMs have actually taken a lot of heat. I'll show you in a couple slides here, some of the issues, but PBMs are taking heat because they recommend the programs to control costs. Patients sometimes don't like them. They complain to elected officials. Elected officials try to get at PBMs. Pharma and pharmacies are saying, yeah, that's great. Let's jump onto the anti-PBM bandwagon and try to, kind of weaken some of their power. A couple other federal issues. The rebate issue was talked about at the federal level. We would love for rebates to go away as long as they're replaced with something. And that was the problem with the rebate proposal, is that it was determined that if the rebate dynamic went away, that costs would increase as a result. So the rebate proposal was abandoned. A lot of talk about prescription drug importation. We have concerns, but the proposals that are out there are trying to get at some of the issues that raise concern over importation of prescription drugs. Guidance has been passed, but nothing is actually in play yet, even though there's still a lot of talk of it. So because the federal government has not acted a lot, the states have acted. So over 100 bills that have been signed by state governors over the past couple of years, getting at this issue of high prescription drug prices. The problem is, as I talked about, increasing constituent complaints, a lot of the bills that have passed are getting at PBMs. And if you want to regulate PBMs, that's fine. Regulate PBMs. But the concern has been a lot of the bills that are proposed and some that have passed put restrictions on PBMs. So I'll give you the example of Wisconsin, where earlier this year, a bill was introduced to regulate PBMs. That's how it was sold. 100 out of 133 elected officials signed on to it in the state legislature. That bill also would have put limits on formulary moves. So even if pharma had jacked up the price of a medication 1,000% in 1 year, mid-year a plan could no longer change the formulary. It also would have restricted mail order. Not only could you no longer mandate mail order, you also couldn't even share the savings of mail order with plan participants. So you couldn't charge them 2 copays rather than 3 for that 90-day supply. It eliminated narrow network, so a narrow specialty network wouldn't have been allowed anymore. Would have been pretty significant impacts on plan costs, all under the guise of regulating PBMs. Now that bill, a lot of work was done on that bill, us and others. The plan sponsor ramifications, that has all been removed. It is more focused now on PBMs and some of the PBM pharmacy practices that have gone on. And that really is who was looking to get the bill passed, was independent pharmacy groups. Also in Wisconsin, it was mentioned quickly, a lot of other states have done this as well. The governor has a task force on reducing prescription drug prices. And thanks to the Alliance, I actually was appointed to that by the governor to kind of get at some of these issues. But again, these are global issues, a lot of constituent concerns, concerns for people that can't afford medications. And I'm actually the only one on there representing employers. I would say most closely aligned with my perspective is really the PBMs. So as we look at things to maybe change in the state of Wisconsin that other states have done, how do we protect plan sponsors from added costs? We did have an opportunity to address the group, Paul Meyer from the Alliance, myself, and 3 employer groups that all did a fabulous job, talking about that employer perspective, and I thought it was very well received by the task force. Also a developing trend are these, I'll call them alternative procurement and funding companies. So, these are companies that are looking to save plan sponsors money through a variety of different ways. They're coming out of the woodwork. We have not endorsed any of these companies yet because we do have some concerns, but then there can be some savings. You just kind of need to be aware of how these companies are functioning. So they're trying to mitigate some costs, so lower acquisition costs, maybe through international purchasing, direct purchasing, wholesale pharmacy relationships. They may be trying to maximize some of these patient assistance programs that are out there that pharma provides. Generally, they're going to get paid on a shared savings, so 10 to 30% shared savings. They may get paid on a fixed fee. If you're looking at a shared savings dynamic with one of these companies, you got to keep in mind that rebate dynamic. So I mentioned this 25% of gross cost coming back in the form of rebates. Understand that really only about 7 or 8% of drugs even have rebate value. So that 7 or 8% has significant rebate value a lot of times, which really changes the financials. So if you take slide 39, Harvoni, a Hep C medication, you can see brand, which has rebate value, $37,800. I told you earlier about, the authorized generic dynamic. So it has an authorized generic at $14,400. We don't have insight into what the exact rebate is on this medication. I would suggest, though, that it is very significant considering these numbers. So if the assistance program that you've contracted with to save you money on, for example, Harvoni, says, oh, we can get that drug for $5,000 with assistance, okay, they're going to want to get paid their 30% of savings off of $37,000. That is not what the plan would have paid net of rebates. The difference in these, $23,000, maybe that's the rebate value, maybe not, but let's say it is. You're going to pay 30% savings on $23,000 that you wouldn't have actually paid net of rebates. So the dynamic gets a little tricky on some of these programs and how they're getting paid. Why else you should be concerned? So the FDA does not ensure that imported products are safe, effective, or even that they're the exact formulation as the FDA approved versions. We've heard and read plenty of stories of medications coming from out of this country that are not the same. Also make sure that your stop-loss carrier are going to reimburse these medications, especially when they're purchased outside the U.S. Also know that any of these drugs that would flow through these assistance programs or alternative programs, the PBM is not going to have oversight over them. The PBM contract is not going to have oversight over them. You're not going to be protected by any of those terms. So the contract with that company is what would govern. The savings methodology that is in the PBM contract definitely does not apply to those medications. Anything that you're doing from an audit or monitoring of your spend through those programs is not going to relate to your PBM program. The PBM won't know that a patient is on that medication. So if there's an adverse drug interaction, PBM is not going to be able to make the patient aware of it. And probably our biggest concern with these is that they could dry up at any time, and now where does the plan go to get access to these medications? So things to be aware of. There was a testimonial that we ran across from one of these companies. It said, not only is our company saving money, our employees are getting these expensive specialty drugs at no cost with a zero copay. One employee, for example, is taking the cancer drug Gleevec, which prior to joining cost the company about $10,000 a month. Now the cost is $5,700 a month, which is a huge savings for us. The employee pays nothing, where before he paid $150 per month for this drug. So you look at this and you say, wow, $4,300 of savings, that's significant, great value there, right? Well, remember, you're going to pay 30% of that number. So $1,300 is the price that you're going to pay in savings on top of the $5,700. That's what this company is claiming the price of the drug is through them. The problem is that Gleevec now has a generic. So in 2016, the generic came to market, and you can get the generic for about $5,700. So under this program, you're paying $5,700 plus the $1,300. You're paying $7,000, where you can actually, the patient could get this drug generically for $5,000. So the plan is really paying $2,000 too much. Another developing trend is genetic testing. So a lot of innovation going on here. It's exciting stuff. So some companies have come out with full genome mapping. Others have come out with tests for specific biomarkers. There's a couple hundred drugs where a genetic test would help identify how a patient should take a drug or if the patient will even benefit from the drug. So certainly exciting to remove the, trial and error medicine of our current situation. The one caution that we have for groups is it's not really a whole population solution. So if you were to pay for all of your plan participants to get genetic testing, we think that it's pretty likely that test would just be lost in a patient's medical record. And if at some point in time they want to take a drug that does have genetic testing before a patient takes it, that they just have to have the test reordered anyway. So at this point, we think it'd be waste. But certainly, if there are drugs right now, we know there are drugs right now that patients can benefit from a genetic test. Don't preclude them from doing it. Certainly allow that. Save them hassle, you money, and make the system a lot better. I'll close with some information on brand pipeline. Again, I'm not a pharmacist, so you're getting general highlights from me, not specific clinical highlights, but many drugs in the pipeline, just some of the highlights that can impact plan spend. So we have migraines, several new drugs coming to market. Some of them have already been approved to help the millions of people that suffer each year from migraines. Peanut allergy drugs, one is actually a patch coming to provide some protection from those with the condition. And then one, NASH here, which is expected to have the most cost impact. So a lot of different drugs that are coming down the pipeline. This is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, so the result of our obese population. Gene therapies, very exciting, amazing breakthroughs, cures for conditions that we don't have cures for today. Also amazing are the price tags that these drugs are coming to market with. So a gene therapy is something that you're going to actually get into the patient's genetic material and edit their DNA to replace what is actually faulty or missing. So on the bottom there, Luxturna, which was the first one to come to market, it cures a very rare form of blindness in children, comes to the market with an $850 price tag. Now, it is a cure, and a child, now being able to see, enormous value. I think I'm safe to say, we all want that child to be able to see the rest of their life, but that is a very hefty price tag. Zolgensma is the other one. So spinal muscular atrophy is the condition that it treats. Now the most expensive therapy on the market at $2.1 million. Again, treats a child. So this would be a child with type 1 spinal muscular atrophy, has a life expectancy of only 2 years. And right now we believe that this drug is a cure. So again, huge value to that person's life and that society. We can provide that to people, but it's expensive. So we got to figure out how we pay for these. And I mean, that's another one of the reasons that we advocate for manage as much as you can manage, so that we can even have a chance of paying for these. Granted, at $2.1 million, it gets very difficult. Hemophilia is another class, not on the list. Oh, it is on the list under gene therapies. And we expect a number of drugs to come to market in this area, which is exciting. In total, over 600 gene and cell therapies in the pipeline at last count, and the FDA expects to be approving about 10 to 20 of these a year by 2025, which admittedly is a little bit scary. So historically, approval of generics and the associated brands losing patent protections have provided a lot of savings for plan sponsors and at least somewhat offset the costs of new-to-market drugs being approved. But that trend has slowed significantly. And I remember several years ago we were talking about, this trend would slow. Well, it has. And if you extrapolate it out for 2021 and 2022, the numbers go down quite a bit lower than even the 2020 numbers. What we need to occur, and we hope that it will, is approval and launch of biosimilars. So biosimilars are FDA-approved versions of existing biologic medicines, so think specialty medications, that are often used to treat complex chronic conditions like cancer and rheumatoid arthritis. In essence, biosimilars are to biologics what generics are to brand small molecule medications. So it's no meaningful clinical differences, highly similar to the reference product, and approved by the FDA after evaluation. So slide 48, the U.S. kind of got a late start on biosimilars. Europe is way ahead of us, but we now do have 26 approved, and more exciting, we now have 14 launched, and several were just launched this year, which makes a couple of classes ones to watch. Any place that you see significant red, like Herceptin, that's competition where we're expecting it to drive down costs for those medications that are on the market and the originator product. So if you look at a couple of the drugs that have been on the market the longest, Inflectra is one, and I'm trying to remember what the other one was. I can't remember it, but one we're now seeing, there was a study by Johns Hopkins that showed across, the groups that they studied, 26% savings off the brand originator on one and 32% savings on the other one. Certainly doesn't match, generic discounts that are 80+%, but these are the numbers that we were expecting. 32 is maybe even a little higher than we were expecting. So we do have some hope that as biosimilars are approved and brought to market, that they will lower spend, which then allows us to pay for some of these very expensive medications that are coming in the gene therapy class. So that's everything. I know I went probably pretty fast, but wanted to make sure I got everything in and left enough time for questions. Hopefully that was basic enough for some to get a little bit out of it and advanced enough for others to get a little bit out of it and not be a complete waste of your time. But again, thanks for joining, and happy to take some questions now. So I like softball questions, so feel free to throw those out.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was great. I will start with kind of a basic question we got through the chat function. And for anyone that has questions, please continue to submit them and we'll take as many as we can. The first is, you really talked about PBMs a lot, National CooperativeRx. Can you talk about the difference between the two and how they work together? Sure,
yeah. So the cooperative was formed to essentially negotiate with a PBM, provide payers with expertise and purchasing power in this complex world of prescription drugs. So right now our PBM is CVS Caremark. They're the ones that have not only given us the best pricing over the years, but also our contract is almost 17 years in the making now. So a lot of provisions that the other PBMs are not willing to give us. CVS is really administering the prescription drug benefit. We're watching over the contract, and then we do work directly with our members to make recommendations in their best interest, rather than the PBM making recommendations to them that may or may not be in the plan sponsor's best interest, might be in the PBM's best interest. So again, just like the Alliance, member-owned, member-governed, we're putting our members' best interests first and foremost.
Thanks. Another question we got was, you had talked about some best practices in regards to contracts. Can you provide some examples of performance guarantees?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but you can get pretty specific with certain metrics. So, you could get specific with a customer service metric that the PBM needs to hit. You can get pretty specific with metrics on, the implementation process, and it could be basic. It could be, make sure that it's implemented on time and that the drug plan is active on day one, minute one. You can, again, without having it in front of me, I can't think of all of the different areas, but there are a lot of different metrics that you can put out there, percentages to have the PBM hit.
Great. When it comes to your recommendation on auditing your PBM, is there anything that applies to National CooperativeRx in regards to any auditing processes?
Yeah, there's, we have audits as well. So let's take the rebate guarantee. It's not complicated to audit the rebate guarantee, but a lot of plans don't do it. You know, we see that, you know, the rebate guarantee is not being administered the way it's supposed to. We go back to the PBM. We say, this is the amount you were supposed to give this group. You didn't do it. You know, and then, you know, we make sure that they do. Plans should do that themselves. You know, but otherwise we're doing it. There are also, you know, certain things that we audit as the cooperative, just to make sure that the PBM is putting plan design in place and pricing in place when there are pricing enhancements. I mean, there are all sorts of things that that we do, but otherwise, you know, most of the audit function that I was talking about was, you know, looking back on guarantees to make sure that the contract is actually delivering what it says it's delivering. And you don't check the PBM, whether they're doing it on purpose or not, they may not be meeting their marks and may not be making the plan whole.
Thanks. When it comes to mail order prescriptions, one of our attendees said it's less advantageous to the member, especially with Optum's contract, and it can be difficult to communicate and encourage that usage. Do you have any perspective on that?
Yes, I mean, a couple different things there. One, I mean, I've had people say to me that, oh, well, you know, it was actually more expensive in mail order than it was in my local pharmacy. That is possible, but it's not possible in the aggregate, not from what we've seen ever. Certain drugs could be, but it's rare. Also, you know, it does depend on your contract. So if you have a PBM contract that really isn't giving you much differential at mail order, then no, it may not be as advantageous. In our contract, there's a significant difference between retail and mail order. A plan may choose to not share that savings with plan participants, but a lot of our groups are saying, okay, you want mail order, it's a lot cheaper for us, we're only going to charge you 2 copays for that 90-day supply rather than 3 copays like you otherwise would on a 90-day supply. So, you know, to the person that submitted the question, you know, certainly I agree that can happen, but in the aggregate, it's not the way we see it happening, and it's not the way we see that dynamic working on our contract.
Great. When you were talking about, I'm going to try and get this right, Luxturna, the eyesight drug, you mentioned $850. Was that $850 or $850,000?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. If I said $850, I meant $850,000. That was very confusing. And that's for both eyes.
Great. You had mentioned some concerns about drug importation. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, you know, it's the same, some of the same concerns that we have with the assistance programs. I mean, we know that certain members right now are working with vendors that are coordinating, you know, prescription drug importation from other countries. That's fine as long as, you know, that plan sponsor knows what the risks are. And, you know, there are risks that, you know, that medication comes over and it is not the same formulation as a medication that you would get in the United States. You know, there have been stories about, you know, some of the medications being tainted. You know, we have that same issue going on in the United States with some generics earlier this year that, you know, were found to be tainted from the factory that they came from. So that can happen here as well. We see it much more common when the FDA isn't, you know, doesn't have oversight over the medication. So, you know, there are risks. You know, it's to be aware of the risks and do what you can to mitigate the risks. You know, each employer has to make decisions that are best for their plan. You know, we just try to provide them guidance, pros and cons, so that, you know, they can make that decision.
Great. Can you share your thoughts on the impact that COVID will have on prescription drug spend and access to drugs?
You know, all I can share is really what I have seen and what I have read. So from a drug access, you know, there have been plenty of articles, and then we've heard reports directly from our PBM that we are not expecting any sort of a supply shortage. There were early concerns that India, as an example, where we get a lot of generic medications, was going to and did shut down the border. They're not going to ship any drugs because they want to make sure they have enough for their country. Last I heard, China's back up and running. India's back up and running. They're manufacturing. There was a huge stockpile already of these medications that were out there. I think that I heard either 3 or 6 months was how long we would have to go without some of these countries producing, and for then a shortage to result. So, again, that's reading in the media. You don't always know if all that stuff is true, but we didn't hear any concern from our PBM that there was going to be any issues of shortage. From the issue of cost increases, we've been monitoring the PBM programs that some of the restrictions of, refill too soon and some of that stuff that were opened up. A lot of these maintenance medications, they're generic. They're very low cost. Yes, there's the potential for increased costs as a result of this, but so far it seems pretty nominal, but something we continue to monitor. The only other thing I'll say, I know that some of the PBMs have put some restrictions in the other way. So like, let's take inhalers, where you put a restriction on inhalers so that, one person in my family needs an inhaler, but we stock up in case, we all end up with COVID and an inhaler might help us. PBMs have put programs in place so that doesn't happen, so that those that actually need an inhaler can get an inhaler. Some of those limitations were put in place pretty quickly. So I think that too kind of warded off any potential supply shortage in some of these categories where we may have seen it.
Thanks. What is the cooperative doing to increase the use of biosimilars by its clients, and what have the biggest challenges been?
Well, any one of our clinicians would be much more capable of answering that question, and I would encourage people to reach out to them to ask them. But the biggest thing is awareness and monitoring by us, making sure that our contract is ready for it. As these drugs come to market, make sure our members are getting the appropriate discount, and it's not an area that the PBM is going to collect dollars from until those of us in the market kind of understand the dynamics. They're clinically, I don't want to speak too much because these are specialized classes, and each one may be a little different, but that's the biggest dynamic for us right now, as these drugs are just coming to market, so we're just starting to kind of gain an understanding and promote them more.
If the specialty drugs can be a zero at lower net rate than the PBM, is the only reason you're not suggesting people use them because they go away, and can you carve out specialty drugs?
Well, yeah, kind of 3 different issues there. First, the carve-out issue. So we do have some groups that have, I'm not going to say carved it out. So we wouldn't necessarily, it kind of depends on how you define carve-out. But we have had some groups that have removed specialty and put in one of these programs. We're not certain of the legal ramifications of that, and saying that the patient doesn't have coverage, so therefore it's 100% member pay. So it's not something we recommend, but we will work with the group. The ramifications is that it does change potentially the contract value. So it is something that has to be looked at and discussed, and certainly we would consult with a group on that. The $0 issue, certainly if you can get a prescription drug at a $0 cost, that's very appealing. That's why we say we're not against these programs, it's just we do have concerns. Yes, the concern would be you have 100% member pay on these drugs because you can get some or most of them at 0 cost, and then all of a sudden the program dries up. Pharma turns it off. Now you have a patient that can't get the medication that is $10,000, $20,000. What are the ramifications of that? So that's some of the unknowns that make us concerned. Do you how quickly can you get it put back in place where the plan is actually picking up some of those costs? And then, you know, this wouldn't be enough concern for us to say no to the program, but there is that concern that, you know, what other drugs are they taking, and is this other company aware of those drugs, and, you know, could there potentially be any adverse consequences as a result of mixing medications?
What do you think about Southern Scripts?
I know they got an amazing marketing team that has been scouring the country. That's really all I know. You know, we've had a lot of people ask us questions about them. We have very little insight. We have just seen them pop up in the last couple of years. That's all I can really tell you.
What is your take on employers purchasing medications directly from their on-site clinics?
We have some of that going on. You know, again, there are ways to get it done. It can get a little complicated and sometimes can confuse patients because, you know, they don't necessarily know where to get what medication. But, you know, it's a fine dynamic. You know, we have had situations where, you know, we look into the pricing to make sure that the pricing is better than the pricing in our contract. Some of that can go on. If it's at all close, then, you know, you can always, you know, promote adherence with it a little bit more. So, yeah, I'll just say, you know, we're not against it.
What do you think about Capital RX and their NADAC model versus AWP?
I can't speak specifically to their model. I'm aware of the company, you know, I've seen some of the things that they're doing, but, you know, I'd have to see the actual pricing model to comment.
Okay. As a result of the current pandemic, do you anticipate that production of drugs will return to the U.S.?
You know, it's interesting. I've talked to a colleague about this exact same dynamic, and, you know, I can't imagine, you know, everything returning. But we were talking about, you know, are we diversified as a drug supply chain enough so that if there was a, you know, long-term pandemic and a country like India shut down the borders, you know, where would we get our medications? Maybe this will result in us diversifying a little bit more and having facilities in other countries besides just one country, and, you know, being specialized. And now, does that result in higher costs? Marginally, probably, but, you know, maybe we're more prepared as a nation. So, you know, we try to look at the silver lining in any dark cloud, and that's hopefully one of them out of this whole COVID-19 dynamic.
Can you talk about why drug prices are higher in the U.S. than other countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty well documented that the U.S. does pay higher prices because of, you know, our ability to pay. You know, our patent system sometimes allows higher prices, you know, less competition. Single payer systems, I'm not promoting them, but just to say in other countries, you know, our formulary dynamic here is, you know, much less restrictive than some of the, I'll call them formularies of a single payer system, where another country says we are only going to allow this one or maybe two drugs in this therapeutic class for this condition. Well, that drives prices way down, maybe, you know, below cost, or at, you know, flat profit for the pharmaceutical company, because they know they can get that money from the U.S. You know, it's a complex system. You know, I don't know that, you know, getting them from other countries, I don't think we're going to be able to get enough from another country. You know, and I also don't think that it's going to drive down prices that much if, you know, magically the world opened up all of its borders and had one price for a drug.
Thanks. You mentioned some state legislative initiatives to control prescription drug prices and regulate PBMs. Do these apply to self-funded employers?
So right now, like let's say the Wisconsin bill in its original form passed, would not apply to private sector self-funded employers. So public sector self-funded employers, it would apply to. But there is also legislation that is being challenged at the U.S. Supreme Court level coming out of Arkansas that could change that dynamic, where regulations of PBMs would then apply to all self-funded plan sponsors. Waiting for a decision on that. I think we're several months away from it yet, but I know we're all watching it to see what happens at the Supreme Court level, because huge ramifications for all self-funded plan sponsors if that occurs.
Great, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just ask one more question, which is, what is the likelihood that you think rebates will go away?
I would say less than 1%, and I say that because that's what I've been hearing. You know, the dynamic of a few months ago, people said rebates would never go away. The proposal came out, people said, well, I think there's about a 25% chance now. Those same people are saying, now there's almost no chance. It is an issue that has kind of died, and we saw some recent numbers looking forward in our contract, and it looks like at least our PBM expects the same, that the rebate dynamic will not go away. Again, as I commented, we think that's somewhat unfortunate, but only in the regard of we would like to see a different pricing dynamic where it was all discount and not rebate. It's just that, you know, the market players are not putting that together, at least not yet. And now it looks like politically it's not something that will be looked at anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your time, and thank you everyone for all the great questions that were submitted via chat. We really appreciate your time. We will be putting this recording as well as the slides on our website as a follow-up, and we really appreciate you guys joining us today. Please stay safe and stay home. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.